All right, thanking God again. Let's call Amos chapter 2 what? Because there are times that beyond our motives, what or the things that we're doing are so absurd that the motives might not even matter. And so in the three nations that God is addressing here, the what stood out to me more than the why, which is what we talked about in chapter 1. Following the same pattern, though, he is going to start addressing Moab in verse 1 of chapter 2, where it says, "Thus says the Lord, for three transgressions of Moab, and for four I will not revoke the punishment, because he burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom," which didn't sound all that bad to me. Understanding as much dirt as Edom was doing back in chapter 1, which is something that Ezekiel is also going to comment on, as we mentioned. But there's still that consideration of what is too far. And so it seems that he might, I don't know, but might be condemning the kings of Moab for being excessive in their treatment of the king of Edom, even though he seems like he's leading a nation during a time when they were behaving in pretty foul ways. There still is a too far. And it seems to come through in the punishment that he is promising them, talking about he is likewise going to cut off their rulers in verse 3. So it seems to go back to that principle that we see from time to time throughout the scriptures: with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. This time giving us insight into what it might have been that actually upset God about the way that the kings or the people of Moab treated the king of Edom. Going on in verses 4 through 5, God's going to turn his attention back to his people, saying, "Thus says the Lord, for three transgressions of Judah, and for four I will not revoke the punishment, because they have rejected the law of the Lord, and they have not kept his statutes, but their lies have led them astray, those after which their fathers walked." And as much as God talks about the lies and the deception that his people had bought into in the days in which they are attracting condemnation, this time the thing that caught my attention about these lies seems to be the fact that they might have something to do with traditions they picked up from the previous generation, something we talked about a little bit in previous chapter discussions, because it is one thing for them to, simply have their own lies. There are times when God is going to chastise them or criticize them for picking up the lies of the nations, gods they had not known. But these lies seem to represent tradition, and tradition sometimes represents nothing more than an excuse to do some stuff we'd like to do. Understanding there are plenty of things we pick up from the previous generations that actually we don't pick them up. We leave them behind because that's not anything we want. But when we want to do some stuff that might be otherwise shady, sometimes tradition is one of those things we draft or drag out as an excuse to do things that we just don't want to take the time to justify when we think that we might be operating in shady or gray areas. Moving on, though, he's going to turn his attention to the northern 10 tribes, Israel, saying in verse 6, "Thus says the Lord, for three transgressions of Israel, and for four I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, those who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, and turn aside the way of the afflicted. A man and his father go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge, and in the house of their God they drink the wine of those who have been fined." That's a whole lot of different transgressions that may fall into two or three categories. Of course, the first one, we've seen it before, the way they're oppressing those who in that society are relatively helpless. Then going on to the way in which they've gotten their sexual freedom, but they're doing the kinds of things that we've seen in other passages. Not even the pagans think it's okay to express your liberation in that way. And then finally, likewise, there are certain things that God had in his law that were either penalties for sins or guarantees against a debt. And even when people have sinned or fallen on hard times, once again, he's reminding us there's a such thing as a too far. And so they were casting off restraints in the way that they were treating those who had either been fined by the sacrificial wine or had given their garments in pledge. And understanding that, God is going to remind them in verse 9 that basically they had to, in order to become a nation, confront some nations that were much larger than they were. So it seems that the thing that God is calling them out for lack of a better term, is becoming the bully, understanding what it's like to be bullied, and understanding human nature. We can all fall into that trap if we're not careful. And so God seems to be giving us an indication of why it is important to genuinely recall what it feels like to be powerless in those times when we might have become more powerful. And as the book of Amos continues, it's going to seem that, especially in Israel, the more comfortable they become in toxic what's or just flat out doing wrong, the less capable they're going to become in understanding why what they're doing is wrong and why it's moving them closer and closer to consequences.